There is a photograph that almost no one alive today has ever seen. It was taken in the spring of 1887 in a city square somewhere in what used to be called the Interior Territories, and it shows a crowd of perhaps 300 people standing in a rough half-circle around a single man. The man is standing on what appears to be a stone mounting block, the kind used for horses, and even from that elevated position he towers over the people nearest to him. The photograph is blurred, the way photographs from that era often are, but the proportions are unmistakable. The man in the centre is not simply tall, he is enormous. His head clears the shoulders of the people around him by at least 2 full feet. His hands resting at his sides are the size of dinner plates. His coat, a dark wool thing with brass buttons, looks tailored not from any shop but from something larger, something made specifically for a body that had no standard measurement to fit. He is speaking. You can see that from the photograph because his mouth is open and his head is slightly turned toward the crowd on his left, the way a man turns when he wants to make sure everyone within earshot catches every word. The people nearest him are not smiling. Several of them have their hats in their hands. 3 of the men in the front row appear to be weeping. The photograph exists in a private collection in Eastern Europe. The family that owns it does not know exactly how it came into their possession. It arrived among a bundle of documents and images purchased at an estate sale in the 1960s, documents whose origin was listed only as acquired during the redistribution period. That is a phrase with a great deal of weight in that part of the world. It means the things that were taken from people who were made to disappear. The family has no reason to fabricate the story of how they came to own it. They have never sought money for it. They have never sought attention. They have simply kept it, the way people keep things that feel important without knowing exactly why. What the man in the photograph said that day in the square has been partially reconstructed from 3 separate accounts, none of them official, all of them written down by people who were there. One account was found tucked inside the back cover of a religious text donated to a monastery. One was discovered folded inside the lining of a coat that had been buried with its owner, found when the grave was relocated during a road expansion in the 1940s. The third account was written by a woman who sewed the pages into the hem of a curtain in her front room, where they stayed until her granddaughter found them while repairing the fabric 60 years later. This is the story of the last giant who refused to hide. This is the story of what he knew, what he said, and why the people who controlled the story of the world could not allow him to keep saying it. To understand who this man was and why his existence was such a threat, you have to understand what was being erased in the decades following what the official histories call the settlement of the Interior Territories. That phrase, settlement, is one of the most carefully chosen lies in the entire architecture of the false history. Settlement implies empty land. Settlement implies arrival into a vacant space, a blank page, a wilderness waiting to be named and organized and brought into the modern world. Settlement implies that what came before was nothing or nearly nothing, a scattering of primitive peoples with no infrastructure and no memory worth preserving. The physical evidence tells an entirely different story. Across the territories that became the American Midwest, across the Russian steppe, across the lands that the maps of the mid-1800s still labelled with words that no schoolchild today is ever taught, there are foundations, there are walls, there are building remnants of a scale and sophistication that the official timeline of history cannot explain. Not because the structures are mysterious in origin, but because they are too recent. They are not the ruins of an ancient civilization lost to the ages. They are the ruins of a civilization that was functioning within living memory of the people who were children in the 1880s. They are the ruins of buildings that had plumbing, buildings that had heating systems, buildings whose stonework and ironwork show a level of craft that the supposed pioneers of the Western expansion did not possess and could not have built. The maps themselves are evidence. When you look at maps produced between 1600 and 1800, maps published in multiple countries across Europe, maps that predate the period of claimed discovery and settlement, you find the word Tartaria or Tartary applied to an enormous landmass covering what is now Russia, Central Asia, parts of China, and significant portions of what became the continental United States. The maps do not show this land as empty. They show roads. They show rivers with the names already attached. They show cities, not frontier outposts, cities, labelled, named, mapped cities in territories that the American history textbooks claim were not encountered by European settlers until the 1800s. Someone drew those maps, someone travelled those roads, someone built those cities and gave those rivers their names, and created a world that was then systematically removed from the official record. The man in the photograph was born into the last generation that had living memory of that world. His name, as best as can be reconstructed from the 3 accounts that survived, was given in 2 of them as Varro, and in the 3rd as something that transliterates from the original script as Varek or Varos, a name without a clear European equivalent. He was known in the region simply as the Large One, which is a translation of the term used for him in the local language, a term that carried respect rather than mockery. He was not a freak. He was not a curiosity kept in a travelling show. He was a man of standing in his community, a man who owned land, who had a family, who was known for the quality of his work and the reliability of his word. He was also, by any measurement that could be applied, approximately 9 feet tall. This is the point where the modern mind instinctively applies skepticism, and that skepticism is understandable because we have been trained to understand that human beings do not reach 9 feet. We have been trained to understand that the tallest recorded human in medical history was Robert Wadlow, who reached 8 feet 11 inches and who died young due to the complications of his condition, a man who required leg braces to walk and who was not strong. We have been taught that any claim of a 9-foot healthy functioning adult is mythology, folklore, exaggeration. But the Smithsonian Institution alone has received and documented and then quietly transferred into restricted storage more than 17,000 sets of skeletal remains recovered from burial mounds across North America. Remains that were reported at the time of their excavation as belonging to individuals of extraordinary physical size. Not one set of those remains has ever been made available for independent scientific examination. Not one. They were documented, they were catalogued, they were transported, and then they were made inaccessible, placed in categories of restricted material under protocols that do not have a clear legal justification in the public record. The newspaper reports from the 1800s are available if you know where to look. The Smithsonian Institution itself published reports in its early years, documenting the excavation of remains that it described as belonging to individuals of abnormal stature, individuals whose skeletal measurements put them at heights of 7, 8, even 9 feet. These reports were published. They were not considered sensational at the time. They were considered simply factual. One more data point in the enormous cataloguing project that was supposedly the purpose of the institution's early archaeological work. And then, at some point in the early 20th century, the policy changed, the terminology changed, the public access changed, and the bones themselves disappeared into storage facilities whose contents have never been made fully public. There is a pattern in how suppression works that becomes visible once you start looking for it. The first stage is documentation. The institution that intends to suppress a thing will almost always document it first, because documentation creates the appearance of transparency. We recorded it, therefore we are not hiding it. The second stage is reclassification. The documented material is moved from public categories into restricted categories, usually under the justification of preservation or sensitivity or ongoing research. The third stage is inaccessibility. The restricted material becomes practically impossible to access, not through explicit denial but through the accumulation of bureaucratic process. The fourth stage is institutional silence, which eventually becomes institutional amnesia. No one currently working at the institution was there when the material was classified. No one currently working there has personal knowledge of the decisions that were made. The decisions belong to the past, and the past is not available. That is where 17,000 sets of giant skeletal remains currently reside. In stage 4, Varro or Varek was alive when the policy was changing. He was alive when the men with institutional authority began arriving in the communities where people like him still lived and worked and remembered. He was alive when the offers were made, when the offers were refused. He was alive when the offers became something else. The first of the 3 surviving accounts describes a meeting that took place approximately 2 years before the day in the square. A delegation arrived at the property where Varro lived, described as consisting of 3 men in city clothes accompanied by 2 men who appeared to be officials of some government function, though which government was not specified. They spoke to Varro for approximately 3 hours. The account, written by a neighbouring farmer who observed the meeting from some distance, says that at the end of the 3 hours the men in city clothes left, looking frustrated, and that Varro stood in the doorway of his home and watched them go without expression. What was offered the account does not say directly, but it says this, that afterward Varro told the neighbouring farmer that they had come to make him invisible, and that he had told them a man cannot become invisible simply because someone else needs him to be. The phrase is striking. It is the kind of phrase a man uses when he has thought about something for a long time and has distilled it down to its precise meaning. A man cannot become invisible simply because someone else needs him to be. He was not talking about physical invisibility. He was talking about the erasure of memory, the erasure of record, the transformation of a living person into a category of thing that official history had decided did not exist. They needed him to disappear, not from the world, but from the account of the world. They needed him to stop being evidence. The second surviving account, the one found in the coat lining, goes into more detail about who Varro was and what he knew. The woman who wrote it had known him since childhood, had grown up in the same territory, and her account is the most personal of the 3. She describes him as a man who spoke 4 languages, who kept detailed records of family histories going back several generations in his community, and who had in his possession documents and artifacts that he described as belonging to the time before the reset. That phrase, the time before the reset, appears in the Tartaria research community as one of the central concepts of what is sometimes called the mud flood theory, or the civilization reset hypothesis. The core of this idea is that at some point in the relatively recent past, perhaps in the mid-1800s or slightly earlier, the visible world underwent a catastrophic transformation. Not a geological transformation in the ancient sense, something faster, something that buried the lower levels of existing structures, that covered roads and foundations and entire neighbourhoods in a layer of material that looked and was officially described as natural accumulation, something that allowed the structures that remained above ground to be repurposed and redated and reassigned to a new official history that had no memory of what came before. The evidence cited for this hypothesis is not all the work of fringe researchers. Photographs of city construction from the 1800s show buildings being excavated from the ground rather than built up from foundations. The lower floors of dozens of significant structures across major American and European cities show clear signs of having been below ground level at some point in their recent history, with windows that open to nothing, doors that are positioned below grade, architectural details designed for light and air that now face solid earth. The official explanation in most cases is that the ground level rose due to development and road building. The counter-argument is that no development program in history has raised the ground level of an entire city by 8 to 12 feet over a period of a few decades. Varro, according to the woman's account, carried with him a memory that predated the reset. Not personal memory, he was not old enough for that, but inherited memory, oral tradition, the deliberate preservation of knowledge by the people who had survived whatever the reset was, and who understood that the official account being constructed around them was not the truth. He knew what the buildings had been before they were reassigned. He knew what the roads had been called. He knew the names of the cities on the old maps, the ones with the Tartaria labelling, the ones that showed a functioning civilization in places where the new official history insisted there had been wilderness. And he knew something else, something that the woman's account circles around without stating directly, something she clearly found difficult to put into plain language. She writes that he knew where things had been buried, not bodies, not treasure in the simple sense, but objects, devices, things that had been part of the world that came before the reset, things that had been deliberately hidden rather than destroyed because the people who hid them believed that destruction was not possible or not desirable, or that the time would come when the knowledge of their existence would matter. She does not describe what these things were. She says only that he had shown her one of them once, and that she had not understood what she was looking at until years later, when she began to understand the larger story, and that when she finally understood, she wept for 3 days. The question that hangs over everything, the question that the three accounts together cannot fully answer, is why he went to the square that day. He knew they were coming for him. The visits had continued and intensified over the 2 years since the first delegation. The pressure had become something more direct. The second account mentions that 2 of his neighbours had been visited separately and had been asked questions about him, about what he said and who came to see him and what he kept in his home. That is not the behaviour of men who are simply trying to make an offer. That is the behaviour of men who are building a file. He went to the square anyway. He stood on the mounting block and he spoke. The 3 accounts agree on the general outline of what he said, even though they disagree on the exact words in places. He spoke about the buildings. He told the crowd that the buildings around them, the ones that the official account said had been built in the previous generation, were older than that account claimed. Much older. He told them that the ground beneath their feet contained foundations that went deeper than any local builder had ever dug, foundations of a civilization that the people telling the new story wanted erased. He told them about the maps. He told them that there were maps drawn by cartographers in multiple countries over multiple centuries that showed their land as part of a vast organized world with a name, and that the name had been systematically removed from every document being printed in the present day. He told them about his own people. He told the crowd that he was not an anomaly, not a medical curiosity, not a mistake of nature. He told them that he came from a lineage that was ancient, a lineage that had lived in these lands for longer than the new history wanted to acknowledge, and that the people now in power had a specific and urgent reason to pretend that his lineage had never existed. Because if his lineage had existed, then everything they were building the new history on was wrong. If the giants had been here, and had built, and had governed, and had created the civilization whose ruins were now being repurposed and redated and reassigned, then the story of who discovered what, and who built what, and who had the right to own and govern what, collapsed entirely. He stood in that square and he said, "I am the proof they cannot file away." That line appears in all 3 accounts. It is the one moment of exact agreement. The woman who sewed her account into the curtain underlined it. The man who hid his account in the religious text wrote it twice. The words are the same across accounts that were written independently, hidden separately, and never compared by their authors. Either all 3 of them were moved by the same phrase in the same way and remembered it identically, or, those were his exact words, landed with the kind of precision that only comes when a man has lived his entire life preparing to say something. I am the proof they cannot file away. He was taken the following morning. The accounts are consistent on this as well. Men came to his home before dawn, more than had come before, and they came with wagons and with documents that apparently gave them some official authority. What happened to him after that morning is not recorded in any document that has been made publicly available. There is no death record, there is no prison record, there is no institutional record of any kind bearing his name, or any variant of his name. He was there, and then he was not there, and the space where he had been was smoothed over with silence the way the mud flood had smoothed over the lower floors of the old buildings. His family was moved. The woman's account says that his wife and children were relocated within the month, sent somewhere that the account describes only as far, and that she never heard from them again. His land was transferred. The records of that transfer, if they exist, are not in any archive that has been opened to public researchers. The documents and artifacts he kept, the ones from the time before the reset, the things he had shown the woman, the things she wept about for 3 days when she finally understood what they were, those disappeared with him. Or did they? This is where the story opens into something larger than one man's disappearance. In the years and decades following his removal, several things happened that, taken individually, mean nothing. Taken together, they suggest that Varro did what people do when they know they are about to be made invisible. They make sure that pieces of the truth are distributed widely enough that no single act of suppression can remove all of them. A series of letters written in a cipher that was not recognized as a cipher for over 40 years began circulating through a network of communities across the interior territories. The letters appeared to be ordinary correspondence, the kind of letters that families sent to each other about crops and weather and the health of livestock. When the cipher was finally recognized and decoded by a researcher who spent most of his adult life on the problem, the letters described in precise detail the locations of several sites where objects from the pre-reset civilization had been concealed. Not buried carelessly, concealed with intention, wrapped in specific materials placed at specific depths, marked in ways that required knowledge of the older mapping system to find. The researcher who decoded the letters was named in no academic publication. His work was circulated privately. Whether the sites he identified were ever located, or what was found if they were, is not part of any available public record. A set of drawings, clearly technical in nature, depicting mechanisms that do not correspond to any known 19th century technology, were found hidden inside the walls of a building that was being demolished in the 1970s. The drawings were reproduced and distributed before the originals disappeared, and copies of the copies exist in several private collections. Engineers who have examined the reproductions have described them variously as impossible, as far ahead of their time, and as depicting principles that are only now beginning to be understood in certain areas of advanced physics research. No one with institutional authority has ever formally examined or commented on the drawings. And there is the question of the photograph. The photograph exists. The family that owns it has never sought publicity. They have allowed exactly 3 researchers to examine it over a period of 40 years, and each examination was conducted under conditions of strict confidentiality. One of those researchers left a detailed written account of what the photograph shows, an account that includes measurements taken from known objects in the image, measurements that allow the height of the central figure to be estimated with reasonable accuracy. The estimate is 9 feet and 2 inches, with a margin of error of approximately 3 inches in either direction. The figure in the photograph is standing on a mounting block with his mouth open and his head turned slightly to the left, and 3 men in the front of the crowd appear to be weeping. And this is either the last public moment of a man who knew something that the architects of the official history needed silenced, or it is the most elaborate and purposeless hoax in the history of a niche research community. There are people who will tell you it is the hoax. They will tell you with the confidence of people who have not examined the photograph, who have not read the 3 accounts, who have not traced the letters or looked at the technical drawings or spent any time at all in the actual archival record of the Smithsonian's early excavation reports, or studied the maps with the Tartaria labeling, or stood in front of the buildings in the major cities, and looked at the basement windows that open to solid earth. They will tell you with the confidence of people for whom the official account is so deeply embedded that the idea of questioning it does not feel like intellectual exercise, but like an act of some kind of disloyalty to reality itself. That confidence is not evidence. That confidence is a product. It was manufactured carefully and over a long period of time by people who had a very specific reason to need you to find the alternative story ridiculous before you had examined it. Consider what is actually being asked of you when you dismiss the Tartaria research as fringe fantasy. You are being asked to believe that the maps were wrong, that the cartographers of multiple nations independently may produce similar errors over a period of 200 years. You are being asked to believe that the Smithsonian's early excavation reports were exaggerated, that the men who wrote them were careless with measurements, despite those same men being considered reliable enough to establish the foundational catalogue of American archaeological knowledge. You are being asked to believe that the buried lower floors of hundreds of significant buildings across the world are simply the result of routine urban development, despite the architectural evidence that those floors were designed for above-ground use. You are being asked to believe that 17,000 sets of skeletal remains simply cannot be examined because of storage and administrative complications, not because their existence disproves something that needs disproving. You are being asked to believe a great many things on the basis of authority, and the authority asking you to believe them is the same authority that had a man removed from a square before dawn, and smoothed the space of his existence over with silence. The woman who sewed her account into the curtain ended her testimony with something that has stayed with every researcher who has read it. She said that after Varro was taken, she spent a long time trying to understand what she was supposed to do with the things she knew. She said she thought about going to the officials. She thought about going to the newspapers. She thought about simply forgetting, which she said was the easiest option and the one that most of the people who had been in the square that day chose. She said she eventually understood that the only thing she could do that had any meaning was to write it down and hide it well and trust that the future was not as completely controlled as the present. She was right to trust that. You are reading her words now, or rather you are hearing them, which is a different thing and a more powerful thing, because words that are heard cannot be as easily ignored as words that are read. Words that are heard get inside the part of the mind that is older than skepticism, older than the trained reflexes of dismissal, older than the education that was designed to make you feel certain before you had looked. There was a man. He was enormous, and he was real, and he stood in a square and told a crowd of 300 people that he was the proof they could not file away. He was wrong about that one thing. They found a way to file him away. They found a way to file away almost everything. Almost. The photograph exists. The 3 accounts exist. The maps with the Tartaria labelling exist. The Smithsonian's own early reports exist. The buried windows exist. The technical drawings exist. The encoded letters exist. The woman's testimony, sewn into the hem of a curtain for 60 years, waiting for hands that would understand why it had been hidden, exists. He was the last of his line to stand in public and refuse the invisibility they were offering. He was the last because after him they became much better at making the offer impossible to refuse. They became better at arriving before a man had the chance to climb a mounting block in a public square and say what he knew in front of 300 witnesses. They became better at making sure that the witnesses themselves were dispersed and isolated and quietly discouraged from writing anything down. But he stood there. On a spring morning in 1887, in a square in a city that the official maps now name as if it were always only what it became, after the reset, a 9-foot man stood on a stone block and opened his mouth and told the truth to everyone within earshot. They could take him. They could take his documents and his artifacts and his family and his land. They could erase his name from every official record. They could make it so that the only traces of him that survived were hidden in coat linings and curtain hems and the coded language of letters about crops and weather. What they could not do in the end was make it so that he had never spoken. The words went out. They travelled through the people who heard them, and through the people those people told, and through the accounts that were hidden, and through the photograph that crossed an ocean in a bundle of estate papers, and ended up in a family that does not know exactly where it came from. The words survived the way all true things survive suppression, not in perfect form, not through official channels, not in ways that satisfy the evidentiary standards of institutions whose entire purpose is to maintain the official account. But they survived. And you are here, which means something in you already knew to look for them. The story does not end in that square. It ends here with the question that has no comfortable answer. If one man who was visibly, undeniably, photographically, not what the official human story says human beings look like, could be made to disappear so completely, what else has been disappeared? What else is buried under the smooth surface of the account you were handed? What else is waiting in coat linings and curtain hems and private collections and encoded letters, and the architectural evidence of buildings whose lower floors were never meant to face solid earth? The last giant who refused to hide was taken before dawn on a morning in 1887. He has been invisible for over 100 years. He is becoming visible again. They did not plan for that. That is what he was counting on. Every person hearing this today is proof that it worked.